Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming on this beautiful Saturday. I'm thrilled to have had the chance to conceptualize and organize this colloquium with Alexis and Ellen Sampson, and I also wanted to thank our colleague Alexandra Palmer. She was unfortunately not able to join us today, but as some of you may know, Alexandra's interest in this topic was prescient and incredibly influential to my own work, so I do want to mention her contribution. I would also like to thank my colleagues at the museum at MFIT for their help with this event, especially Valerie Steele, Patricia Mears, Tanya Melendez, Melissa Mera, Faith Cooper, Tamsin Young, and Onyenide Koyi. I hope that many of you have seen the exhibition and have already gotten a sense of what it's about, or that you'll have the chance to see it later today. It will be open during the lunch hour just across the street. At this moment, I hope to offer somewhat of a behind-the-scenes look at how and why I approached this topic of Fashion Unraveled, what I hoped visitors would take away from the exhibition, and what I've learned so far about visitor response to the show, which I find very important to my work. In doing so, I suspect I will start a conversation that will be followed up upon in many of the papers presented later. This is an image of the first platform in the exhibition, and the museum at MFIT staff affectionately calls this the Charles James Memorial Platform, because this was the platform in our inaugural exhibition in this space a number of years ago. We featured one of James's very large, elaborate, stunning gowns to help lure in visitors. For this exhibition, I chose to begin with a bit more of a demure, but I hope no less intriguing selection of objects. Whether completed or in process, they center on the idea of the dressmaking process itself. Although this may be somewhat subtle, this was my first attempt within the show to disrupt the all too typical narrative of perfection and runway-worthy polish that characterizes many exhibitions of fashion. The pattern for a Comme des Garçons dress, which you see printed on muslin and hung on the back wall, is complex and somewhat indecipherable to anyone without dressmaking abilities, and I hoped that this would remind visitors of the skills necessary for every aspect of fashion making. The particular platform that houses these objects is relatively small and rounded, and it allows visitors to view the garments a bit more closely than usual. They can easily spot the pins, basting stitches, and pencil marks on the Balenciaga toile, while comparing those to the more polished but clearly inspired design by Yohji Yamamoto. Visitors have been especially fascinated by the toile, underscoring the importance of material analysis that is critical to the exhibition concept. As you see throughout the exhibition, the stories behind the making and or wearing of garments, whether they're known or speculated, is especially important. It is not widely known that Yamamoto's toile-inspired dress was based on his study of Charles James's fascinating muslins, which were then housed in the Brooklyn Museum collection, and now part of the collection at the Costume Institute. Some of James's muslins were rendered as half garments, better explaining Yamamoto's choice to drape a layer of black cotton over one side of the otherwise streamlined silhouette of the dress. The first main section of the exhibition was given the name Behind the Seams, and I know that's a little corny, but it does explain my desire to include objects that were acquired with interesting stories from their makers or wearers. And we do include these narratives in the notes field of our database, but often when we show these objects, these aren't the types of stories that end up being told in label copies. So I did want to give viewers a sense of the histories behind some of these garments. So in essence, I selected these garments in an attempt to remind us of the personal connections that we can sometimes have with our clothing. It's often believed that such connections were stronger in the past than they are today, as we live in an era of fast fashion and fleeting trends. So in an attempt to test the validity of that assumption, MFIT devised its first major crowdsourced initiative, which we called Wearing Memories, and we launched a call for participants several months before the show opened, asking them to submit short stories and images of garments that they either held in their possession or that they wore that they had a very strong attachment to. We received more than 300 entries to this. It's actually an ongoing project through the run of the show in November, and feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. So I just wanted to include a couple of examples of just a handful of those stories that ended up in video format within the exhibition. On the top is an entry from MFIT's president, Dr. Joyce F. Brown, and she included a story about this gorgeous coat that her grandmother made for her that she continues to keep in her closet. And on the bottom is part of a story by Scott Bodener, whose husband unraveled a sweater worn by his late partner to remake it into a vest for Scott. And as Scott himself says in his story, it was the sweetest love song he'd ever been part of. So I personally still can't watch this video without tearing up a bit, and I've seen it many times. It was my intention to select garments with similarly interesting personal narratives for behind the scenes. This particular ensemble was quite intriguing in several ways. The donor provided information about its purchase in 1946, just after World War II, from a somewhat rare couture label, Mad Carpentier. The outerwear set comprises a sleeveless coat and cape, which is quite oddly constructed despite its overall polished appearance. The donor explained that some of the ensemble's quirks, such as its mismatched tartan and the lack of lining in the coat, were the result of fabric shortages. This makes sense, but a close inspection of the pieces revealed scraps of fabric that were meticulously pieced in at corners to provide more length or width, indicating that the fabric had perhaps been recut and pieced together from something else. Based on the weight and appearance of the wool, I also began to speculate that this was perhaps cut from a blanket. So as I did a little research on that idea, I found this article from Life in 1947 that demonstrates that this method of reuse was not only somewhat common, but encouraged. It is well known that clever techniques to make, do, and mend were promoted during World War II, and blankets provided lengths of fabric that were warm and durable and usable in a time of need. I have no evidence that the Mad Carpentier ensemble was fashioned from a blanket, but I still liked its general connections to World War II era clothing culture and the possibilities that arise from the close examination of a garment. The museum at MFIT prides itself on providing only curator-led tours through all of its exhibitions. And since I've been working at the museum for 12 years, I've given a lot of these tours, and you get a lot of feedback. And one of the questions that often arises, especially when I'm showing really beautiful mid-century couture, is, well, how much did that cost? And typically, we don't have an answer to that question. It's very hard to know. But in the case of this stunning Jean Dessay gown, we actually do have a sense of what it cost. And the reason for that is that it was donated by the model who wore it in Dessay's 1956 couture presentation. And when she donated this piece, she told us that its original cost was $15,000, which is about $140,000 today. And this is, of course, quite costly, but we also learned from the donor that it's made from 66 yards of chiffon, so that's a lot of fabric. The inclusion of this garment also underscores the privilege that curators give to certain narratives over others when they display clothing. I knew that our visitors would love to learn about the cost of a 1950s Dessay gown, but limited word count left me unable to tell another part of the gown story, which was that while we were renovating our collection storage here at the museum a number of years ago, there was a small leak that got onto the bodice of this gown. Fortunately, the quick action taken by our conservators has allowed it to survive with very little visible destruction. The museum at MFIT has an incredible collection of objects. We have about 50,000 garments, accessories, and textiles. So it may seem a bit strange that from that large selection, I intentionally sought garments that show evidence of wear and their past lives. In reality, the clothing within museum collections, especially that from the 18th and 19th centuries, very often shows signs of repair or modification. In this section, Mended and Altered, I attempted to focus on the subtle changes that are often made to garments, those that can be more easily disguised by the necessarily low lighting that we have in gallery spaces, the strategic placement of a garment to disguise its flaws, or the careful work of a conservator. And the latter aspect, that of the work of the conservator, tends to be the least acknowledged within the process of exhibition making. When I take people through on tours, they often say, well, how long did it take you to dress all these mannequins? And I have no part of that. That's our conservation team, who is incredibly skilled in that task. And of course, the conservator's work is generally meant to be invisible, but I really liked the idea of highlighting it within Fashion Unraveled. These circa 1740 shoes were a fantastic way to make that point, since the conservator's work on the right shoe is anything but subtle when compared to its partner. And I am by no means a conservator, but my research on these particular objects was greatly helped by the fact that someone wrote a master's thesis about the work done to these shoes in 1997. And the original condition report included information on such serious issues, which you can still see on the left shoe, such as water damage and detached heels. The right shoe was treated using myriad techniques, which included humidification, stain removal, and stabilization with crepeline. And obviously, this is technical and very skilled work, but I do believe that a general description of what that work is can be understood and appreciated by visitors, expanding their understanding of the teamwork that is essential to exhibition making. I am also interested in overcoming certain prejudices that curators or conservators may have about altered or imperfect garments within their collections. This lingerie dress, which originally dates to the early 20th century, was modified in the late 1960s or early 1970s, very likely for wear as a wedding gown. However, the modifications were very beautifully and quite subtly done. So one of the best modifications is to the waist. Obviously, the original wearer would have been wearing a corset. The later wearer chose not to do so, so she very carefully unstitched some of the pin tucks around the waist to help expand the waistline, and then disguised that modification by adding that ribbon belt. So even our conservators commented on how beautifully done this work was. I've also included a copy in the exhibition and a close-up here of the countercultural fashion magazine Rags. And I wanted to highlight why I think this lingerie dress is actually historically significant despite its alterations, and I feel that the magazine helps to tell that story. Nancy, pictured here, is wearing an early 20th century dress that is somewhat similar to the lingerie gown, and she's modeling for an article entitled Old Clothes, Never Trust Anything Under 30, which I think is a great title. And this editorial provides an important snapshot of the growing trend toward wearing, and often by extension altering, vintage clothing during the late 1960s and early 1970s. As such, our subtly modified gown tells an important part of fashion history and stands out among a sea of the fashionable lingerie-style gowns that often exist in museum collections. This is just a quick overview of the second platform on mended or altered clothing, which includes everything from Denise Poiret's Melody dress, the purple dress that you see on the far end, to darned stockings in the center in the case. And I could go on about all of these garments at length, but I really want to focus on one that was both fun and somewhat frustrating to research, and which interestingly underscores the importance of teamwork, persistence, and believe it or not, a lot of Googling, which I will get to. This is a quick overview of, there we go. Sorry about that. So when I was first thinking about the search terms that I could plug into our database to find mended and altered clothing, maternity wear came to mind. It would only make sense that, particularly in the days before stretch fabrics were very popular, women would let out and take in clothing over the course of pregnancy and postpartum. So this Jacques Fath suit came up in my search, and there were notes in our database about its numerous alterations. But when I actually went to look at this garment, there were so many stitch lines, a complete lack of lining, seemingly homemade adjustable panel that had been placed over the belly. It was actually a very confusing garment. So although it had its Fath label stitched into the correct spot, there was little indication that anything else is original. And in fact, I ended up asking our senior conservator and senior curator to come in and look at it with me because it was so baffling. And really none of us could decipher what kind of trauma this object had been through. But we did realize that the really beautiful sleeves had been left intact, which did give us some sense of its original couture craftsmanship. But for some reason, I just didn't want to give up on this garment, and so I continued to try to research it, and after many, many Google image searches, came across the fashion photograph that you see here. And the suit that we have could not have been fashioned from this cocktail suit. The proportions aren't right, but my suspicion is that the maternity suit was originally a coat that was cut into two pieces, and the skirt was turned back to front. And so I continued to research the donor who had dated the suit to circa 1958. And that was a little bit confusing because the photo of the cocktail suit was definitely from 53. But as I continued to look up this donor, I discovered that her first child was born in 1958. So I believe when she donated the suit, she dated it to the date of its alteration, not of its original design. As I hope I indicated earlier when speaking about the cost of couture garments, I always find visitor feedback to be immensely helpful to my curatorial practice, finding out what people like to look at, what they respond to. And some of our visitors have really loved this particular redesign because they've told me how difficult it was in the past to find fashionable maternity wear. So they kind of nod and say, yeah, I would have done the same thing if I'd had that Fath piece. My ongoing interest in repurposed clothing is actually what's inspired this exhibition. So this is the largest section in the show. This is just one portion of it that you see here. There are myriad reasons that a garment or textile was made from one thing into another, but the three primary categories are economy, sentimentality, and sustainability, a bit of which I'll be talking about today. But I wanted to begin this section with one of my favorite pieces in the MFI Tea Collection, which is a circa 1840 dress made from circa 1760 silk from Spitalfields in London. And there are many reasons that I love this dress. The first is that it actually has a strong sentimental meaning, as I included it in my first exhibition I co-curated here in 2008. And that was about 250 years of women's roles in the fashion industry. And we believed that the silk from this dress was designed by Anna Maria Garthwaite, who was a prominent Spitalfields designer with quite a distinctive style. But even if the assumption that Garthwaite designed this silk is incorrect, the gown attests to the cleverness of the 19th century wearer or her dressmaker. The original bodice was turned back to front, the ruching was added at the neckline, and to create a fashionably pointed waistband, a separate self-fabric belt has been made. But what I think is perhaps most special to this garment is that it has been kept with its original sleeve ruffles for more than 250 years, and it's quite rare that scraps like this survive with altered garments. And I also just wanted to point out that since researching this gown more than 10 years ago, I've developed a fascination with 1830s and 1840s gowns that are remade from 18th century silks. And I found that, in fact, a lot of them are made from Spitalfields silks in particular. And so I'm always kind of hoping to come across some kind of historical article or reference to this phenomenon, which appears in Britain, but also across the US as well, as you can see from the two examples here. Rather than organize the objects in the repurposed section chronologically, I arranged them by type. So here we have a couple of examples of feed sack garments, of course the crazy quilt in the center, and a couple of refashioned denim pieces. And in particular, I'll be talking about the piece that's in the center there, the maxi skirt, that is from circa 1970 and has been remade from an old pair of jeans. And the acquisition of this actually tells kind of a fun behind-the-scenes story at curating, and I'll show you some details from a couple other related objects. The ohm symbol in the front is the skirt that I've included in the exhibition, but these types of personalized or customized and repurposed denim pieces from this era of the 60s and 70s are pretty hard to find, and in fact we only had a couple of examples in the museum's collection. It was only when my colleague Emma McClendon curated her timely and very popular exhibition on denim a few years ago that a collector contacted us with the offer of several more customized, often repurposed examples of denim skirts, jeans, and jackets from the 60s and 70s. So often when you put on an exhibition, people realize that something they have in their personal collection may be of value. So that was a very wonderful donation. I finally had the chance to include another favorite piece from the collection in this show, and this jumpsuit was made and worn by Betsy Johnson in 1966. At the time, she was in a relationship with the musician John Cale and fashioned this jumpsuit from some of his old rugby shirts. And I have had a bit of a thing for this jumpsuit for years, and it wasn't until quite recently that I was able to include it in a show because it's very small, and it wasn't until we got a new cache of quite petite mannequins that we were able to dress this. And so I was really happy to see it on a form, but I will also say that part of the reason I love this jumpsuit so much is because the image you see of Betsy wearing the jumpsuit was in a book called Radical Rags by Joel Lobenthal. It's all about 60s fashion. I found this book when I was a child, and it inspired my love for fashion history, so I always say that book is the reason I'm here. And here's the last view of the repurposed section, and I'll just quickly go over this. It features pairings of Army-Navy pieces, menswear, and Chinese dress at the far end of the platform. But I'll talk more specifically about Maison Martin Margiela's sock sweater, which has become one of the brand's best-known designs, but the museum's own history with this style is unique and important in its own right. We acquired our first example directly from Margiela in 1991, shortly after its design, and it was received during the tenure of Richard Martin, whose ideas for what to collect for the museum were often quite visionary. In 1994, after Martin had left MFIT, the museum put on a show entitled Hello Again, Recycling for the Real World. And this was, as you can guess, all about recycling, but it included things such as sporting goods, home furnishings, furniture, and a number of other recycled designs. I really think that clothing, however, took center stage in this show. And it was at this time, when we put on this recycling exhibition, that we acquired this full sock sweater vignette. So you can actually see the original Army socks hanging on a hook, a sweater in progress that still has its pins intact, and then we got another version of the final sweater. We also have a few really intriguing unfinished garments in the collection, and I wanted a way to highlight these while also making the transition into the final sections of the exhibition. On this platform, only half of the objects are truly unfinished, beginning with the black and white mini dress and extending to the tweed dress at the far right. These pieces are intentionally made to look unfinished with raw edges, etc. But this is one of the truly unfinished objects, and I've had my eye on this in the collection for about a decade now. The MFIT objects are in the case to the right. It's the front 6 panels of a Madeleine Vionnet dress from the 1920s, made from varying shades of chiffon with embroidery by Lesage. And although these are really stunning, they are uncut and unfinished, and ethically we are unable to cut and finish them ourselves. So we will never be able to make these panels into the dress you see at the left, which is in the collection of the Palais Galliera. Interestingly, this case has been a favorite among visitors that I've taken on tours. I thought they might be a little disappointed that we didn't have the completed dress, and although they like seeing that in the photograph, they have told me that they find it really fascinating to see a garment in progress and think about how it would have been completed. So this was a bit surprising to me, but of note for future exhibitions. And I think it may also be indicative that people are becoming a bit savvier about fashion exhibitions and are ready to see something that's less familiar. I view the final two platforms on distressed and deconstructed fashion as an epilogue to the exhibition. Although the unfinished or decaying appearances of these garments were entirely intentional, they relate to the concepts seen earlier in the exhibition. So for example, I often like to compare the denim maxi skirt with the ohm symbol that I mentioned earlier to the high-end designer denim pieces in the center. So for example, the hostess gown, you can just see that little snake applique in the front, would probably have cost a few $1,000s at Serendipity rather than being the sort of homemade hippie denim that we looked at earlier. Two more Margiela objects speak not only to ideas of distressed and deconstructed fashion, but also to the museum's role in preserving objects that were intended to self-destruct. The more familiar designs seen here are the Tubby Boots from 1990, which are now a signature Margiela design. And this pair was really heavily overpainted so that they were meant to crack and decay over time and reveal the dark cotton canvas beneath. But because this pair was worn only once on the runway, the degradation is fairly minimal. The bustier was made from bits of cardboard posters found around Paris and assembled in a papier-mache-like effect and overpainted. And likewise, this object was not meant for longevity, but it has since been carefully preserved on a custom mount in our exhibition, or in our collections, and has never been exhibited before this exhibition. And the final platform is devoted to deconstructed fashion. In addition to the more obvious choices by avant-garde Japanese designers, I wanted to include work by designers such as Albert Elbaz for L'Envent, whose pink dress, featured sort of in the center here, simultaneously stands out and works within the aesthetics of deconstruction. And interestingly, I've noticed that a number of, in my past experience, visitors tend to react somewhat negatively to deconstructed fashion when it's included more irregularly in an exhibition. But it seems in this show to be better understood. Once we've made it through the other sections and had more of a discussion leading up to ideas of deconstructed fashion, people seem to like it a bit more. And I wanted to conclude by pointing out that the museum has a fantastic collection of early 1980s designs by Rei Kawakubo. It actually made it really difficult to choose which to include in the exhibition. But when I viewed this t-shirt next to a jacket by Junya Watanabe, I realized how easily the influence of Kawakubo's work on Watanabe's designs could be seen in the seemingly haphazard but actually intricately constructed black knits, which draws subtle links between past and present that I hope visitors catch on to as well. So in conclusion, despite my long-held interest in repurposed fashion, this exhibition was an experiment for me. I was curious to see how our visitors would react to imperfect objects and found that they provide intrigue and spark conversations and personal narratives. And I know we will see much more of these ideas as the colloquium continues. Thank you.